if viewers or listeners learn one thing from this podcast, they could learn how extraordinarily brutal, how savage, and what an unpleasant experience for everyone the Korean War really, really was.
Andy, can you introduce yourself to start this conversation, please?
Yeah, sure. I'm Asia editor at the Washington Times, based in Seoul. I've written 2 books on the British role in the Korean War, which I highly recommend, by the way. Am I allowed to do that?
You're allowed.
Thanks. One's called To the Last Round, one is called Scorched Earth, Black Snow. And I guess those 2 projects are why I'm here with you now, talking about the Korean War on the eve of 25th of June.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you very much for being here.
Okay.
And so the purpose of the conversation, Andy, is just to try to provide an overview, to tell some stories, to create more interest and knowledge in this conflict as we come up to the anniversary. June 25th, you've already given us the date, 1950.
Actually, that's the wrong date, but nevertheless, continue.
Well, then that's where we should start. If we want to understand the Korean War, where do we start? We can't start at the Big Bang. That's too far back. Where do we start?
Okay, I'm not going to answer that question.
We're off to a good start.
We're off to a good start here, yeah. And I'll tell you why.
Yeah.
My research, my work, my interviews, the stuff I spent my time doing was not about the geopolitics of the war. It wasn't about the politicians. It wasn't about the generals. Mine was really, I wanted to know what was it like for a foreign soldier from a Western country who had never heard of Korea, literally as a nation, before getting on a troop ship. What was it like for him to come to this very strange, distant, and very alien land? What was it like operating in this operational space? What was it like to actually be in combat? What was the nature of the combat? What does that do to men, both physically and physiologically? And 70 years later, what did it all mean to them? How was this important for the rest of their lives? So that was what my research was about. If you want to learn about the origins of the Korean War, there are literally dozens of books on it, and it's a thorn bush. There's a lot of very, very different approaches to it. The history has changed over the years. So, as I said, I'd rather not answer that question. What I will do is let me tell you a little story about just one man who pretty much answered all the questions I had, all the questions I referenced earlier. And he was a young English guy. I think he was 19 or 20 when he came to Korea. He was a soldier with a unit called the Royal Northumberland Fusiliers, which was very, very heavily engaged in the big battles of 1951, some of the fiercest fighting the British Army has done since World War II. And he had a most remarkable story. So he had come to Korea, knew nothing about the Koreans. Like most British soldiers, he'd heard of Joe Stalin, of course, because of World War II. Had never heard of Mao Zedong, never heard of Kim Il-sung. Came to Korea, had never heard of Korea, because Korea was erased from the global mind map and global atlases by 35 years of Japanese colonialism. And so, what was it like for him? And he told me a remarkable story that I tell a lot because it just tells you so much. So his experience of combat, and well, let me preface that, because a lot of times soldiers will talk among themselves. They'll ask themselves, are we doing the right thing by being here? What side should be on? And if viewers or listeners learn one thing from this podcast, they could learn how extraordinarily brutal, how savage, and what an unpleasant experience for everyone the Korean War really, really was. And so after the Chinese had intervened in the war and had pushed all the UN forces out of North Korea, there was a question of what was going to happen next. That question was answered sometime after midnight on the very, very last day of the year, as the Chinese launched their New Year's Day offensive in the very early hours of January the 1st, 1950. Guys who were in encampments south of the Imjin River, they heard this distant thunder rolling in the distance. Of course, that wasn't thunder. That was the Chinese artillery preparation as they began this massive offensive aiming to capture Seoul, or recapture Seoul. The North Koreans had captured it in June 1950. So David's unit just before this big offensive had started, had been posted in somewhere, I'm not exactly sure where, north of Seoul. And they'd seen some pretty brutal behaviour from both sides already in the war. And they heard shooting in the hills nearby. So his company, he was in Zulu company, a Z company of the Fusiliers, sent a patrol to find out what was going on. And they found it was an execution site. South Korean military police were executing civilians in a long trench, shoot, body falls in, next line come along, shoot, bodies fall in. This is a classic execution technique, widely used by the Nazis on the Eastern Front and used by both sides in the Korean War. So the soldiers were extraordinarily discomforted by this. These are our allies. And so the company commander, who was an extremely gentlemanly fellow and became a hero later in the war, Johnny Wynne, said, we won't stand for this. He stood his company to, told his men to fix bayonets. They advanced on the military police and told them to drop their weapons. So this is British soldiers intervening in a very internal domestic affair, albeit an extremely lethal and bloody one. And David says he remembers that. The police explain, we're shooting deserters, and in a war, that's legitimate. Deserters are shot. But he said that these weren't just deserters. They weren't just young men. There were some very, very young men who looked to be below the age of conscription. And there were women too. And, they were just dead bodies lying in this trench. So the company faced down these South Korean policemen, drove them off and just told the surviving civilians to get out. And that became a major diplomatic incident. But David would later say that was the best thing we did over there. We saved, some civilians. So here's a guy who has some questions about the mission at this stage, and then he's engulfed in really, really intense combat. And what he said was this. After the Chinese attacked over the river on the night, New Year's night, the border units, the American and South Korean units crumbled, and his unit was shoved forward into the line. These guys were the strategic reserve, which is the most dangerous job in any battle, because when there's a crisis, you are sent forward. And they dug in the hills just south of a place called Hanyang, which, as you know now, is big city, Ilsan, just a small village back in the day. But it covers the northwest approaches to Seoul. So they dug in there and went into defensive positions and awaited the onrush of the enemy. Freezing cold January day, January the 3rd, 1951. And David said, I was in the forward trench of the forward company, of the forward battalion, of the forward brigade, of the entire forward UN command on that day. And he said, battle started for me. I was standing in my trench, two-man trench. My mate was sleeping in the trench next to me, and it just started getting light on January the 3rd, 1951. That date's important. And as it was getting light, I started to just see over these barren, mountainous snowfields near Bugaksan now, good hiking, but very rugged, tough, bare-ass, cold terrain. And he said, this Chinese soldier stood up in front of me. It was a reconnaissance soldier, a very young guy, and he was so close to me, my rifle barrel was touching his chest. So I pulled the trigger, and the guy literally fell on top of me. So I pushed him off onto my friend, who woke up in alarm. And then we heard this roar, the sha, 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 kill, kill, kill. That's the Chinese war cry during the war. And downslope, just hundreds of figures stood up from the snow and charged towards us. This was the assault, the human wave. So he says, we immediately started shooting. We were fighting all day. We called in artillery, called in mortars, absolute chaos. Terrifying, noisy, close range mortal combat. And the whole time this was going on, the Chinese soldier was lying covered in his sort of bloody, frosty tunic, gurgling at the bottom of this trench, because most times in war, you're wounded, you're not killed outright. And his bullet had gone through the Chinese soldier's lungs. So this young guy was essentially choking to death on his own blood. And pink bubbles of blood were coming out of this tunic. And these guys didn't have any first aid training, or they couldn't get a first aid guy to their trench. They were engulfed in combat, so they left him there. That evening, after dark, they got the order to withdraw. They managed to break contact, got into trucks, raced through Seoul. At this point, Seoul is on fire. It's night. Seoul is burning as ammunition stores are blown up. The city is being abandoned to the enemy. And this brigade is about the last unit to pull through. So we're in the back of trucks. There's this glow all around us. We rattled across the Han River Bridge in the darkness. We could just see the surface of the frozen Han River and countless Koreans, Seoulites, struggling across the river, some with oxen, with cattle, their possessions on their backs, just trying to get out of the city before the Chinese arrived. He said, an absolute nightmare. And he could never get this young Chinese lad out of his mind. Anyway, he fought in another extraordinary action when his company was surrounded and were fighting literally hand to hand. The Chinese were running through them. They ran out of hand grenades. They were throwing ration cans at the Chinese, a very famous action. And Johnny Wynne, this very humanitarian company commander, was wounded 3 times in this battle just south of the Imjin River. So he had a pretty rough war. But anyway, he survived the Korean War and went home to the UK. And it was later in the Royal Navy. Then I think he was in the post office, and then he retired. And now it's the 1980s. It's 30 years after the war. And he said one night I was alone in my house at night in the English countryside, and I was sleeping, and I felt this strange, frightening, sort of malevolent presence in my bedroom. And so I wasn't sure if I was dreaming or if I was awake. So I sort of opened my eyes, and sitting at the end of my bed was a figure. There was someone in my bedroom sitting on my bed. And he says, my eyes adjusted to the darkness. I made out this field cap and this tunic, and it was this Chinese soldier sitting on the end of my bed, in this dirty, frosty uniform with these bubbles of blood coming out of his chest. And this guy was just looking at me, and I was looking at him. And eventually daylight came, and this apparition disappeared. And this happened again and again and again. He said, I saw psychiatrists, I saw psychologists, I saw priests. I went to Combat Stress, which is the veterans hospital up in Scotland. And they said, you've got the worst case of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, that we've ever seen. I think he had electric shock therapy, drug, and nothing worked. This ghost would reappear again and again and again. He thought he was losing his mind. So one of his friends said, David, there's only one thing you can do. You've got to go back to South Korea. And he said, I don't want to go back to that horrible country. Every memory there is fights for survival, piles of dead bodies, devastated, burned villages. It was hell on earth. I don't want to go back. But his friends convinced him to come back. And this is now sometime in the 1980s. So he came back with a group of veterans. And they flew into Kinne Airport at that time. As they got off the plane, he said, I was literally shaking. My hands were shaking. But we got into the bus, and as we drove into central Seoul, I could not recognize the cityscape. High rises had replaced the thatched huts. The dirt tracks of the Korean War had been replaced by superhighways. The military vehicles had been replaced by Hyundais and Daewoo's. I couldn't recognize the place. So they arrived at the hotel the veterans were staying at. There was a big sign at the hotel, "Welcome Korean War Heroes," or something. And the next day, all the veterans were going to go to a memorial service up at the Hanyang. So David checked into the hotel, went to his room. Somehow he broke his belt. So he went down to the gift shop in the hotel. And he said, "Excuse me, do you have any belts?" And there was a young girl sitting at the counter, and a very, very much older man behind her, and sort of gestured, over there. So he went, got a belt, and presented it and said, "How much?" And she says, and she was interrupted by this old man, who was possibly her grandfather. And the old man spoke English, as a lot of the older generation Korean did. Said, "Are you one of these returning veterans?" And David said, yeah, I am. He said, "Well, in that case, there's no charge for you. We won't take your money." And David said, at that moment, I was devastated. I fell apart. I started crying, as if a huge weight had been lifted off my shoulders. And of course, the next day, he went to the memorial service at the Imjin River, where, of course, the veterans give scholarships to the local school children. And he mingled with the children and with the other South Koreans. And he said, I was astonished. I realized then that what we had done in Korea had a good outcome years, decades down the line. And he said, after that trip to Korea, just my mind was cleared, and that ghost never visited me again. So that was the kind of person and the kind of experience that I wanted to find, I wanted to mine. What's it like for these guys? Yeah.
Why would these guys, such as Johnny Wynn and the other gentleman's name, David?
David Strachan. Yeah.
David Strachan. Why were they chosen? Were they conscripted? Did they sign up? I'm sure there were various reasons, but 1950 England...
1950 England, the first brigades we sent into battle in Korea, 27th Brigade, which was in Hong Kong, 29th Brigade, which was at the time, the Imperial Strategic Reserve, were filled with a mixture of troops, an interesting mixture. They were professional soldiers who were, many of the younger ones, they wanted to come to Korea because, it's a war, this is why we signed up. The officers and NCOs, the sergeants, the corporals, very largely fought in World War II, so they had a lot of combat experience. There were some conscripts who were not too keen to come to a war in a place they'd never heard of. And of course, there were a lot of old reservists who had signed up for 5 and 12, 5 years in uniform, 12 years on the reserve. So these are guys who had fought in World War II, thought their service was over, then suddenly you're told, the king wants you, and they're recalled to the colours, and they filled in the ranks of these battalions to put them up to full strength before they came to Korea. So you had a mix of experience, but to the best of my knowledge, we've never had that combination of HR in any British unit since, which I think is why those 2 brigades at the time were highly effective. They were considered by UN Command almost as elite units, although they were straight infantry. They weren't paratroopers or Marines or special forces.
Yeah. You talked about the worst case of PTSD that people had seen with the seeing of the Chinese apparition in the tunic. At the time, there wasn't really much said about the Korean War. Or how do you see the presentation of the Korean War, perhaps during the 50s, the 60s, the 70s? Because Vietnam had entered the public consciousness with movies, with soundtracks. It was
in the 80s, I would say, yeah.
But the Korean War, the Forgotten War, I've heard it called. I mean, how has this narrative been played out?
A couple of things. Firstly, it was called the Forgotten War as early as 1952, when it was still on.
Wow.
Because after the very, very dramatic early months of the war, from June 50, North Korea invades, Seoul is lost. The South Korean forces, soon joined by the Americans, are pushed back to the Pusan perimeter. So all that's left of South Korea is Daegu and Pusan. Then you have MacArthur's extraordinary landing at Incheon in September, which completely dislocates the North Korean People's Army. Push back, Seoul is retaken, NKPA pulls back into North Korea. UN forces then counter-invade North Korea, get all the way up to the Yalu River on the Amnok-gang, and then the Chinese intervene in one of the greatest turning points of 20th century history, push the UN forces out of North Korea, retake Seoul, heavy fighting, and only in late summer, fall 1951 did a line start to coalesce, and we get the front line not too far from the 38th parallel where it all started. And of course the fighting, instead of these up and down the peninsula massive mobile operations, we then have 2 years of Sitzkrieg, trench-style warfare, very similar to World War One, but not in the Western Front, in the mountains and hills of Korea. But because that kind of war was not nearly as dramatic as, we've captured Pyongyang, oh my God, there's this new enemy, we're pushed down, are we going to lose South Korea, are we going to use nuclear weapons, all these things. There was a huge loss of interest by the public. So the term the Forgotten War was actually coined, I think, in 1952.
Wow.
And the war wouldn't finish until June 27th, midnight, 1953. And the other point is, the public consciousness. I mean, history is taught poorly, if at all, these days. It's a minor part of the curriculum, so people don't really learn from school. So people learn about history and mighty and terrible events from popular culture. Now, the Korean War followed World War II by just 5 years. And of course, it takes a couple of years for people to start working out what had all happened. And then, of course, in the 50s and 60s, you get this stream of very, very good films, television series, histories, all coming out, hitting the public mind, all about World War II, greatest war in history. Korea didn't get that. Korea was fought very much in the shadow of World War II. And then, 10 years after the end of the Korean War, the Americans were in action in Vietnam, which was a much more photogenic war than Korea, because you had color cameras and you had television. You had neither in the Korean War. You had newsreels, you had newspapers, and everything was black and white. So Vietnam was the first time that war came to your living room via the television. So people could actually watch the war in their home at night in vivid color, against a background of rock and roll music, and against a background of significant domestic protest against the war. And of course, that war, unlike Korea, ended in defeat for South Vietnam and the US. End result was, this was a national trauma for the United States. Americans will say, we didn't lose the war, the South Vietnamese did, but if you're driven from the field and you abandon your allies, you've lost the war. And so this was the first war America had lost. And this became a national trauma for the States, celebrated in film, song, TV, some pretty decent novels, but most particularly in film. And I think by the 80s, you had some very, very good films. I mean, Platoon, Apocalypse Now, Born on the 4th of July, a string of very, very good films coming out about Vietnam. And of course, that buried any last memories of the Korean War. So in terms of popular culture, the Korean War, never really impacted the Western psyche.
It might be interesting where you described the Vietnam War played out in colour television to the soundtrack of rock and roll, and that necessitated your discovering of stories and people's experiences, because that might be one way to tell it. What did people say when they arrived in South Korea or in Seoul? So you talked about, did you learn anything about these first impressions, or these people coming from the United Kingdom? And
they arrived in Busan by ship, not by aircraft for the most part. And people said you could smell Korea before you could see it over the horizon. because in those days, Korea was a very, very poor agricultural nation. And in those days, the night soil, which was human manure, was used on the fields. So you could literally smell it from over the horizon. Wow. But as one or two of the ships, as they're approaching Busan, and the guys were, on deck looking down, sort of, what is this place we've come to fight in? Saw these blackened lumps floating in the water. They thought, what are these? Are they buoys? Are they buoys? And as the ship passed them, they looked in, they see these were sort of mouldering corpses from fighting or executions, both of which were rampant at that time. So it was a pretty grim approach to the theatre of war. The 1st Brigade that arrived, 27th Brigade, had come from, the flesh pots of Hong Kong, where you could get tattoos and steak and chips and good weather, pretty girls and stuff. And you pull into Busan, and they were told, we may have to fight off the ships, lock and load. And they were on the Nakdong River, which was the the front line within 2 days of getting off the ships. Wow. One of the guys said, we got off the quay. There was actually a band on the quay playing some music, and we got off the quay, got onto a train, and next to us on the other platform, coming south, we were heading north up to the front line. This was coming south, was this another train, and we looked out of the windows to this train. It was just full of, moaning young men who bandaged up. It was a hospital train. These guys were all being evacuated with some very, very nasty wounds to get out of the carnage. And we were heading towards it.
Wow. It's a very sobering thought, all of this. Was there anything said about their experience of the Korean people? Obviously, it was a different time, language and attitudes might have been a bit different, but you spoke about the grandfather in the shop that gave the belt for free. That's kind of a nice, warm story. It's a beautiful thing in terms of interactions between the forces or the people. Yeah,
of course, you can't, and let me just talk a little bit about the role or the space of the Korean War in this wider area of Korean studies. Yeah. They're almost two completely different areas. There's the Korean studies, which is the history, the culture, the economics, the socio-economics, etc., which is all about Korea and Koreans. But much of the historiography of the war is written by military historians who are focused almost exclusively on the role of, whatever unit they're covering, the Americans or the Brits or whatever. And so they're telling war stories, and the war, the stories they're telling could be in Western Europe, or they could be in North Africa, or they could be on the Eastern Front. They're just classic war stories of operations, tactics, weapons, fighting, camaraderie, and so on. One war is any war, right? So there's a real difference between those two areas. I find that a lot of Korean studies people, they just don't study the strategic or tactical or technical aspects of war. It's not their area. And similarly, the military people don't know much about Korea. Many of the historians who write about it have never actually been to Korea. And so never the twain shall meet. I'm a little bit unusual. I was writing pretty much military history, but I'm in Korea. I live in Korea. So obviously I spoke to a fair number of Koreans who had experienced this as well, from generals down to interpreters. But yeah, so all that having been said, of course, you can't fight a war and have no contact with the civilian population. So just some of the memories that come out, let me think. Early in the war, during the fighting on the Nakdong River, that summer of warfare, the guys, when they came out of the line to go back to their billets in villages in the rear, they were very taken with the young Korean women, because in the countryside in those days, the young women wore, the young married women were essentially topless. The jima exposed the breasts, and the guys all sort of remember that. This is something that's not well recorded in the photography of the time, because of course you couldn't publish photographs like that back in the 50s.
Was that for breastfeeding?
It was yeah. Again, Korean studies has uncovered all this now, but for many years this was almost not talked about. But the guys, obviously here are all these young men. Many of them had never had a girlfriend before, seeing all these attractive maidens working in the fields. Yeah. A lot of them remember the children. Because, of course, what happened in this up-and-down war, so many civilians had become completely dislocated. And there was just countless orphans everywhere living a very, very bareback sort of existence. And there weren't too many NGOs in those days who had come to the aid of civilian populations. Nowadays, you can deploy NGOs in places like Gaza to assist with humanitarian suffering. In Korea, that wasn't so much the case, although the American Christian groups did do a huge amount of very good work here after the first few months. So there are a lot of children that I think pretty much every UN unit would adopt some small children. And some of the guys became very, very attached to these kids who were they weren't in the front line, but they were attached in the rear, and they'd clean your boots and they'd help cook and so on, and the people, the guys would take care of them. One of those guys later became a professor at Yonsei University because he learned, Anglo-English. And in the 1970s or 1980s, the Sergeant Major of the RUI became quite famous. I can't remember what he was famous for, but he'd left the army by that point. And there was a retrospective sort of documentary about his life, and they actually tracked down the Korean professor and brought him to meet him back in the UK, which was quite emotional, as you can imagine. So they'd last seen each other in a war-torn country when the professor was just an orphan child. And you asked, we were talking a little bit earlier on about how the Korean people are different today and then. And I think one thing that's very, very clearly, everybody commented on the stoicism of the Koreans in those days. Koreans back then were an agricultural people. They lived tough, hard scrabble lives. So they weren't given to great displays of emotion. One guy remembers a little boy coming through the lines, and his most of his hand had been shot off, and it was muddy and messy and stuff, and they dressed him. And this boy didn't utter a murmur, Imagine that today. I could go on and on. How much more do you want?
I've got so many questions. Let me ask you this one, which is a bit of a tangent, but
go on.
How does studying this conflict and other conflicts and war and these stories affect your own mental health? I know that's going to be a question that might make you bristle as a but you spoke about the soldier's PTSD and how it affected him. You have to talk about stories of orphans and young children with hands blown off and things like this. Does that have any effect? Is it hard? Is it necessary?
I wouldn't say. I was reporting this stuff. I wasn't experiencing this stuff. There's a vast gulf between experience something traumatic and writing about it. Let's not pretend I was there. What was difficult was asking some of the difficult questions to some of the veterans. But I was surprised that so many veterans were prepared to speak very, very openly and frankly, because I think, again, coming back to the Forgotten War, when they realised that, here's British journalist who's writing these books, who's clearly interested in setting the record straight, telling our stories, they opened up. When I asked about things like war crimes, atrocities, which did happen on both sides, they were surprisingly open about it. One man who's sadly passed away recently was Viscount Slim, who sat in the House of Lords. He was the son of Bill Slim, who was the greatest British general of World War II. He led our troops in the hideous, the horrific Burma campaign against the Japanese. And he was, as you might expect, was a serious warrior. He had led Gurkha troops in the jungles against the Japanese when he was like 17 under his dad. He came to Korea with the 1st Battalion of British troops to land, the Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders. He was a captain by that point. He subsequently joined the SAS, which is the British Special Forces, and served in Malaya, Borneo, Oman, all these sort of semi-secret conflicts. Very interesting guy. I introduced him to a Korean president at one point, and the first thing he said was, "President Lee, let me tell you, I'm not a very nice fellow."
So this was Viscount Slim.
Viscount Slim, yeah, who's a serious character. Anyway, I was asking him about, I can't remember how we got onto it, but about the fighting down on the Busan perimeter when they were fighting North Koreans in front and North Korean partisans or South Korean partisans in their rear. So it was kind of two wars going on in one battle space. And he was saying how a patrol had been ambushed behind the lines by either a North Korean sort of infiltration group or partisans. I can't remember. It's in the book. And so we got really angry. So we got a fighting patrol together, and we went out. We found these guys, and I can't remember. I think we killed 10 of them or something. I said, "What about prisoners? You must have had wounded North Koreans and stuff." And he said, "Well, in war, it's big boys' rules. They get 10 of you. They get 5 of yours. You get 10 of theirs." So he was talking about shooting wounded enemy on the battlefield. Wow. And that happens in every war. So some of them came out with things like this. I mean, the most surprising was I was sitting on a bus. It was a veterans revisit. There were British, Australian, Canadian veterans. And I was sitting at the back of the bus talking to a bunch of these guys. And one of these guys, just out of the blue, I think he wanted to get it off his chest, told me the story of when they were up in North Korea just before the big Chinese attack, or around the time of the big Chinese attack. And they were patrolling through this ruined village in this blasted hellscape as winter descended. The Manchurian winter descends on Korea. He said there was this old Korean man sort of fossicking through the ruins, probably looking for stuff from his own home that had been destroyed or blasted by bombing or artillery fire. and he heard the shot ring out. The guy fell over dead. The guy next to him was, recocking his rifle. He said, "Why did you shoot him?" He goes, "I just wanted to test my rifle." Oh. So this is a soldier who, in this sort of heart of darkness of war, where you're surrounded by death and destruction, murdered a civilian because he thought that civilian's life had absolutely no worth. And this was the very unpleasant side of the Korean War. You're fighting an alien enemy in an alien landscape, and you fail to see the humanity of the people around you. Although, again, contrasting with that is the fact that so many units were so kind to so many civilians, particularly the orphans.
Yeah.
So you have extremes of human behaviour.
Can you say anything about the North Korean advance? Because we've mentioned Busan a couple of times, and then you've mentioned how they were fighting North Koreans in front and then partisan or infiltrate South Koreans behind. Yeah. So this is North Koreans, when they instigate and start the war, they capture Seoul almost immediately. They push
3
down,
days,
3 days, they push down. And can you just say something, maybe, do you know anything about that, and how close did South Korea come to being completely taken? Was the North Korean offensive that was strategically very clever or good, or why did it work?
Okay, there's a lot to unpack there. I mean, firstly, the North Korean forces, and again, to come back to your earlier question, which I didn't answer because it's just too much to discuss, the origins of the war, I think it was very obvious that to all players that this situation, i.e. a divided country in a divided world with two ideological opponents on either side of a faux border, a false border that's been imposed upon people by powers far beyond their own control. This situation's a tinderbox, and it was going to end in war one way or the other. The Americans took the point of view, Ri Sing-man, just like Kim Il-sung, wanted to unify the peninsula, and if he had the power, he would have done it. So the Americans didn't supply him with offensive weapons. He didn't have armour, heavy artillery. I don't think he had much of an air force. Stalin, after much sort of pleading and wheedling by Kim Il-sung, did supply the North Korean People's Army with T-34 tanks, brigades of T-34s, which was one of the best tanks in the world at the time. This was the weapon that smashed the German army on the Eastern Front in the biggest tank battles in the history of warfare at that time. He supplied them with some heavy artillery. When Kim first came up with his war plan, apparently, Kim had some experience as a guerrilla in Manchuria. But I think his highest rank in the Red Army was major, so he had no training as a staff officer, and I suspect many of his men didn't.
He was a young man at the time as well.
And he was a very young man at the time. So his war plan was pathetic, so that the Soviets looked at this and said, look, hang on, you can't go to war with this plan, let us write it for you and tell you how to do it, which they did. And so the original war plan, as you say, they moved very far, very fast, and were very successful. Basically, the North Koreans were supplied with very, very good information, and they had the tools of maneuver warfare. The Americans, to their sort of great credit, if we're going to pass judgment, refused to supply Ri with this kind of weaponry because they knew what he'd do with it. So why were the North Koreans so successful so early on? For reasons stated, but the other point that's worth mentioning is that the two best units, divisional-sized units in his army, had been fighting for years in China with Mao's 8th Route Army. So these guys were battle-hardened. These weren't guerrillas. These guys had been fighting main force warfare in the Chinese Civil War, and they joined Kim's army, the NKPA, just before the Korean War started. So he had it all. He had the equipment, he had the planning, and he had some very, very battle-ready troops. The South Koreans, on the other hand, they had some experienced troops. They'd been fighting the IJA, right, the Imperial Japanese Army, in counterinsurgency and some main force warfare in China. But again, the officers who in 1950 were colonels and generals were probably lieutenants or captains in the Japanese army. They didn't have heavy weapons, and so when the North Koreans they attacked, I think with tactical surprise, on the night of June 24th. Not June 25th. I'm not quite sure how that date has become set in the stone of history. The main forces attacked in the very early hours of the 25th, but the first attack of the Korean War was potentially a game-over attack. It was, and this is what happened on the night before midnight on June 24th. Kim loaded a civilian ship full of partisans and sailed them down towards Pusan. And their job was to go deep behind enemy lines, capture Pusan port, which would have prevented the Americans in Japan from reinforcing. Wow. As it happens, that ship was challenged just off the coast by a very, very smart South Korean naval commander in an old submarine chaser, which is a very small warship the Americans donated to the nascent South Korean Navy. And he challenged the ship, realized something was wrong, and pretty much on his own initiative, sank it. Wow. And that was on June 24th. So that, if that hadn't happened, that engagement, who knows what might have happened. And the North Koreans were also, to this day, they're very good at asymmetric warfare, right? They're good at using unusual tactics. So when they took the city of Kaesong, which, remember, back in 1950 was actually in South Korea, right. Their attack was they basically got a train, blacked-out train, rode it into the station at Kaesong and into this silent, well, it wasn't silent, it was a thundery night, June 24th, June 25th, but a stormy summer night, sultry summer night. So this unscheduled train arrives on the platform and the North Korean troops attacked off the platform. Wow.
It's a Trojan horse almost.
Trojan horse.
Trojan train.
Exactly.
Yeah. And just to finish this last part, how close do you think South Korea was to...
Yeah, pretty... Well, if South Korea hadn't been supported by the Americans very, very early on, I mean, General MacArthur, who I guess we'll talk about in a minute, on his own initiative, without consulting high command, sent a ship of ammunition escorted by Americans into Pusan on, I think, the second day of the war. So the South Koreans were driven back. Seoul was taken without a huge amount of fighting in the city. And, in a series of battles down, the major north-south communication lines, the last two significant areas left in the hands of the ROK army in summer of 1950 were Daegu and Pusan, hence the term the Pusan perimeter. And that's when the Americans were just feeding more and more men into the line. That's when the British arrived in August 50, to the point where towards the end of that campaign there were more defenders than offenders. So the North Korean People's Army were breaking their teeth on a hardening defense. And they didn't manage to break through, enabling the continued existence of South Korea. What happened next was MacArthur, in his greatest strategic stroke, put two divisions, including his best troops at the time, US Marine Division, on ships which incidentally were manned by veterans of the Imperial Japanese Navy, sailed around the peninsula and landed 250 miles in the rear of the front line at Incheon. And complete tactical surprise, the North Koreans were completely dislocated. And one of the two sort of big mysteries of the Korean War, which I don't know an answer to, is how the NKPA managed to disengage, escape through pretty much the length of South Korea and regroup in the north by October, which they did, including with their heavy armour. So MacArthur, I think, and Walker, his battlefield commander, Walton Walker, made a mistake. They didn't pursue fiercely enough because they should have been able to close the trap, attacking, eastward from Incheon and northward from the Naktong and cut off the NKPA. But the NKPA actually, I guess, a North Korean odyssey, successfully disengaged and will live to fight again as they defended North Korea when, in October, the UN forces invaded North Korea, the first and only free world invasion of a communist state during the Cold War.
Wow.
Can you say... a march into catastrophe.
Yeah. Can you say something about General MacArthur? Because obviously what he did in Operation Chromite, the landing in Incheon, is something that saved South Korea, and it's the reason we can sit here and have this conversation. Yeah. Reading Gary Bass's Tokyo on Trial, I think it's called, he's portrayed as sort of, lording over all of Japan, above the emperor and things like this. He's a
bit of an imperial sort of figure himself.
Yeah. So very complicated. But do you have any sort of view on MacArthur as a person, how he managed this? Because obviously great achievements, but then removed from his position during the battle.
During the war, sure. Incheon, brilliant.
Yeah.
Defense of South Korea. I think he saw that. He made a famous speech just before Incheon, and I'm remembering this from memory, right? I'm not reading this, so I may get this wrong, but you can look it up. It's one of the great speeches of modern times. Incheon is a really difficult place to conduct an amphibious landing. Yeah. It's deep in the Yellow Sea. The tidal issues are tremendous. There are no beaches to storm. You've got to fight literally up a seawall, which is very easy to defend. And so the US Marines and the US Navy said, look, forget it. We're not doing this. This is an impossible task. And after hearing their presentations, MacArthur stands up and says, I've heard the ticking of the second hand of the clock of destiny. Global communism has made its play for global domination here in Korea. I will land in Incheon and I will crush them. And apparently there was silence in the room. Then the US Admiral stands up and goes, Sir, the US Navy will take you to Incheon. So that gives you some idea of the power of the man. He was, he had charisma. He had a way with words. And if you listen to him, there's tapes of him, he sounds almost Shakespearean. He had this verbal charisma. And in one of the most famous and notorious films in the history of Hollywood, which was made in the 1980s, this movie called Incheon, with an exclamation mark at it, which was almost wiped from the cinematic records. It was the most expensive movie ever made and the most expensive flop ever made.
I've never even heard of this.
Yeah, sort yourself out. You should know this.
Okay, yeah.
This was before cool Hallyu filmmaking, right? But MacArthur is played by Laurence Olivier, the great Shakespearean actor. Yeah. And he was criticised for overacting. But if you speak to people who knew and met or been around MacArthur, he said that's what he was. He was a bit like an actor because he had this charisma and this ability. So he was an impressive man in many ways, but very much a flawed hero. I think it's fair to say he trusted his own judgment too much, which is a terrible human flaw. I think he was also, again, we said a bit of an imperial sort of character. He was surrounded by yes men, which is a danger for every kind of dictator. You don't get the kind of answers you want. People say what they think you want to hear. And this is one of the great dangers of the Kims, because we don't know what kind of counsel they're getting. A fascinating figure who made a great triumph, and then in October was the author of a great and terrible disaster, which continues to haunt American foreign policy to this day.
And the disaster was?
Rhee and MacArthur got along very well. Rhee Syngman, the president. Rhee wanted, understandably, to unite Korea under his banner. MacArthur, being a general, wanted victory, total victory, not a limited war. He wanted to go all the way. So it didn't take much for Rhee to convince MacArthur, we've got to, we're not going to stop here at the 38th parallel. We've cleared South Korea. Now we've got to finish the job. We've got to head north. And, well, as we know, that became the worst disaster faced by American arms since World War II. The bloodbath at the Kunuri Pass, the huge retreat, that almost Napoleonic retreat from the wintry north, the displacement of about 700,000 Koreans from their homes, a Scorched Earth retreat when everything behind us is destroyed, and of course that pivotal moment in global history when China, the sleeping dragon, which had been seen as useless in war since the Opium Wars, through the Boxer Rebellion, even in World War II, suddenly the sleeping dragon awakes and is seen as an extremely dangerous foe.
Were there plans to take China as well, and use of nuclear weapons? I've read these things.
Yeah.
I'm not sure, we can't say for sure, but do you have a take on this?
Yeah, no, most of this has been declassified now. So yeah, we know. All right, China. One of probably the key difference between Truman and MacArthur, President Truman and General MacArthur, was their view on China. Remember, America had just lost China. 1948, 1949, the nationalists are cleared out of the mainland. Mao Zedong declares, the East is red. So this was a huge loss for the Americans. And there was a massive China lobby in the States. Remember, to a large extent, World War II in the Pacific for the Americans was all about China. So MacArthur was very keen to get Chiang Kai-shek engaged in the war. And this again comes down to our own time, when there's a lot of strategic linkages between Taiwan and Korea vis-a-vis China and North Korea. And this is talked about a great deal nowadays in sort of Indo-PACOM. Truman was not in favor of extending the war via Chiang Kai-shek because he thought that would bring the Chinese into the war. So that was a deep issue between the two. When it comes to nuclear weapons, the first person who publicly stated it was not MacArthur, it was Truman. As the Chinese surged south and were basically destroying and forcing UN forces into that hideous retreat from North Korea, which to me is the most extraordinary operatic period of the Korean War. He was asked at a press conference in, I think, was it December 1950? He didn't say it himself. He was asked at a press conference, Mr. Truman, are you considering all means at your disposal in the prosecution of this war, or words to that effect? And he said, yes, all means. And sort of so that means nuclear weapons. So there was a little bit of planning, and I'm not sure if it went up to the Joint Chiefs or it was just in Far Eastern Command, in which MacArthur came up with one idea for bombing certain sites around China with nuclear weapons. I think there were 34 nuclear weapons he had called for. And he wasn't the only one. When he was replaced by General Ridgway, it went up from 34 to 38 nuclear targets. So it wasn't just MacArthur. And MacArthur certainly wasn't fired over this issue of nuclear weapons. Another idea that was floated, but I don't think there was any serious planning done, again, and I think this was in Far Eastern Command, was to create a cordon sanitaire between China and North Korea from the Yellow Sea to the Sea of Japan, or from the West Sea to the East Sea, if you prefer, by basically using radioactive materials or explosions to just cut the Korean peninsula off from the Asian mainland, which meant that there would never be another invasion of Korea from the north. And again, that, I think, thank God, and very sensibly, I didn't think that ever got to the planning stage. So I think a lot of the talk of nuclear weapons, we can say in retrospect, was a bit panicky and it never really got that far. But of course, looking at it back in the day, the British Prime Minister Clement Attlee was so disturbed after Truman's press conference that he immediately flew to Washington to have closed-door discussions with Truman about, we cannot use nuclear weapons. And of course, Attlee was also extremely concerned that the Chinese were now in the war, because there was just as this fear of linkage with Taiwan, Britain at the time had a colony in Hong Kong, and there was a real fear that, could the Chinese surge across the border and take Hong Kong, expanding the war.
Before we talk about the retreat, this huge movement that you talk about as being so important and dramatic, there's three little areas here that I want to focus on. The first one is, can you perhaps say something about the fighting itself? Because I've heard you talk before about fighting in the cities and the photos from Max Desfour and the close combat. I've heard that the Korean War is famous for the amount of civilian deaths. Whereas, I'm not sure if this is true or not, but
Let's break those two issues there. So let's talk about the combat.
Yes.
And then the civilian deaths.
And then after that, I want to ask you very briefly about ideology, because if you're a Korean person in 1950, these ideas of do you support communism or capitalism, when the men come through the villages with the guns...
You have two flags. There's literally photographs of an old man. I think it's in North Korea. There's these laughing South Korean soldiers because the man's got a North Korean flag in one hand and a South Korean flag in the other, and he's not sure who's coming through this time.
Yeah, and it's your life.
And, and feasibly, your life could be on the line if you raise the wrong flag.
And
that did happen.
Sam Denny's friend Kim Kyung-jin, he survived the Korean War by teaching North Korean songs to people in Seoul. He said that's how he got through it, and he still remembers the songs, and he sang them to me. The fighting, this kind of close combat, and the civilian death.
Okay, well, let's talk about, we talked a bit about the NKPA. Let's talk about the CPVA, the Chinese People Volunteer Army, which was basically the regular People's Liberation Army under cover of an international legion. Bear in mind that this was the recipe for anti-fascist moves during the Spanish Civil War, which was in the 1930s, which was not a distant time in 1950 or 51. To this day, historians do call the Chinese the CPVA, even though we now know they were literally regular divisions of the People's Liberation Army. So this was sort of diplomatic camouflage deployed by Mao. But anyway, so the Chinese had a terrible reputation for fighting for a century plus before the war started. And that's why I think people like MacArthur and Charles Willoughby, his intelligence chief, weren't too worried about Chinese intervention, because the Chinese had a bad reputation as soldiers going back to well beyond living memory. That reputation would be overturned with shock suddenness here in Korea. The Chinese had very, very good leadership. One of the first Chinese soldiers to die in the Korean War as these units infiltrated under cover of night, under cover of camouflage, into the North Korean mountains, was Peng Duhuai's personal assistant. Peng Duhuai was a guerrilla general who had fought with great success during World War II and in the Chinese Civil War. Very tough guy. He was Mao's second choice to fight in Korea. The first general, General Lee, said, I don't want to take this command. I'm not going to do it. And Peng Dehuai, when he was called to Beijing, he stayed in the hotel that night and was given this mission by Mao. According to his memoirs, he was so disturbed he couldn't sleep. So being the sort of guerrilla general, he gets off the hotel bed and slept on the floor. Tough character. But one of the first casualties was his assistant, his adjutant, I think, a young captain called Mao Anyin, who was the son of Mao Zedong. So just as Stalin had sent his own son into battle in the Red Air Force in World War II, and he was killed, Mao sent his own son in with the first wave of Chinese troops to cross the Yalu. And these guys knew what they were getting into. They would be fighting the most advanced, technologically advanced, mechanized army in the world, the US. So they called the gates, the bridges across the Yalu, the gates of hell, and they called themselves human bullets. They had no illusions. This was going to be a tough fight. But what they did, they had an extremely smart tactic, which most people don't understand. It's called human wave. And it goes back to, Mao Zedong came up with it, but he stole it from Sun Tzu, right? The great Chinese classical strategist. And so what happens is, under cover of night, because the Chinese don't have tactical air force, so they maneuver at night, and they attack at night. So they're kind of a spooky army, a ghost army. They will mass forces in front of an enemy position, the UN command position. And at the sound of bugles, because again, they don't have radios to signal to each other, so they're using a Roman era technology, military technology, bugles. And funnily enough, old tech works. In the Korean mountains, radio signals are dreadful.
Still
the ROK army to this day don't have good field radios. And we live in the era of Samsung mobile telecommunications, right? So in many ways, the bugles were more effective as a signaling device than radios were because of the broken terrain. And they had a psychological effect. It's like, what is that? And it sounds more like a bagpipe. It's a spooky sound. Everyone says it's a frightening sound to hear this in the night. And you know immediately, here they come. So on the bugles, the columns would attack in a frontal attack. And this is what most people think of human wave, the mass attack into the teeth of the defense. But the point of the mass attack is, maybe, and in many cases, you'll overrun the defense and the defenders will run or be killed. But while the big battle is going on, other Chinese units are moving around the sides, around the flanks of the enemy unit, getting behind it and setting up positions behind it. So roadblocks, ambush positions. So when the unit, which is under attack, tries to send its wounded back or get new ammunition up to its position, it finds itself it's cut off. And this can lead to panic. And so the unit has to try and break out down a funnel of fire. And this works incredibly well for the Chinese. The biggest defeats suffered by the US Army and British Army since World War II, at Kunuri Pass and at the Imjin River, were by the judicious application of this Chinese tactic. Frontal attack fixes the unit in place, while other units get in deep behind them to dislocate the unit and set up ambushes on their line of withdrawal. So this is what happens in October, November 1951. And for those who saw those early attacks, absolutely terrifying. And when you see the very rare occasions when you could see the Chinese in the open, the British forces were advancing on the left or western flank of the UN advance, northwest of Pyongyang, over the Chongchong River. And they said in the first battle with the Chinese, the Battle of Pakchon, the Chinese, one of the guys, I can't remember who it was now, he was with the Middlesex Regiment, I think one of the first two British battalions in the war. He said, I was on outpost duty, and we looked into the distance, and I didn't have binoculars, just the naked eye, and there was a hill changing colour. I guess I'd never seen anything. What is that? I couldn't work it out. And I squinted into the distance. Then I realised what I was seeing. There were like hundreds or thousands of men running down this hill towards us. And so Pakchon became this very desperate battle in which the British had to fight through these Chinese positions to cross the bridge over the Chongchong to get beyond the reach of the Chinese. So it was a running battle. And the guys who were fighting their way down the road with American armour, shooting into the hills, running, setting up positions, shooting again, running, setting up positions. So we were on the low ground on the road because we had vehicles, and the Chinese were on the high ground. And what you do is you look up at the ridge lines, parallel to the road, and it looked like a moving forest.
Wow.
Because the Chinese had all put foliage in the top of their helmets as cover against air attack. And so one of the officers said, I remember that famous line from Macbeth, from Shakespeare, till Burnham Wood to Dunsane do come, which spells the doom of Macbeth. He says that's what it looked like. It looked like the entire ridgeline was moving. So both the tactics, the fast movement of the Chinese, these were tough. These were peasant infantry, very, very light infantry, no heavy artillery, no armour, very, very good at moving cross-country. And, of course, the UN troops at that stage of the war reliant on road transport. And so basically the country was given up to the Chinese. So, when you're moving down roads, through valleys, under ridgelines, you can come under hideous fire from the Chinese. So incredibly effective. The sleeping dragon had woken, and within weeks, North Korea is cleared of United Nations forces as they pull out of North Korea in this panicky retreat that becomes known as the Big Bug Out. In the British Army, to this day, they still use the term bug out for a fast retreat. We've got to get out of here.
Was it a noble retreat? Was it a necessary retreat, this big retreat from enemy? Because you've written about this, you've written about the last stands, you've written about the ways in which people would have to stand there. And it makes one contemplate just what you would do in such a situation. Can you say something about this bug out, this retreat?
Yeah, I mean, they were, again, what was not quite clear at the time was how fast we could move compared to how fast they could move. They could move fast on two legs. Yeah. They weren't carrying a huge amount of equipment. They were tough, they were hardy, they were peasants and so on. But of course they didn't have vehicles. We had vehicles. So if a road was clear, we could move out very fast.
What were the numbers like? Sorry to interrupt you. Is it like, I would imagine they had numerical superiority?
I mean, when Brigadier Code, during that very first Chinese intervention in October, around Halloween 1950, and he came to an abandoned American HQ, they'd left very, very quickly, and there was a map on the wall with red lines on it, and someone had scrawled in a red pen 1 million ? So there was a sense that there was a huge number. What we know now from sources is that the Chinese were very, very good at massing at the point of contact. This is what you want to do in war. You want to mass your forces, the most powerful of your forces, against the enemy's weakest point. And the Chinese were very good at doing that. So it would appear they had vastly larger numbers. In fact, for the first couple of offensives, you're looking, I think, at around 200,000 men, which is a lot of men, but not vastly superior to the UN forces at that time. Albeit the UN forces, you might have 6, 7, 8 soldiers supporting every guy at the front line, because the Western armies, especially the US Army, has a lot of logistical tail, whereas the CPVA were very much a frontline fighting force. They didn't have a huge amount. They had a lot of porters in support, but 12,000 men in a Chinese division, the majority of those would be combat ready. So we now know, sure, that 1 million, no. But 200,000 men is a lot of guys. Yeah. D-Day, you're looking at about 150,000 men hit the beaches, and that includes airborne troops. The German advance on Stalingrad, 6th Army was 200,000 men. And the biggest Chinese attack of the war, which happened in April 1950, that was just under 1/3 men on a 40-mile front. So these are big numbers. And
part of it, like you said, perhaps is the tactic of appearing bigger than you are, and moving at night, and foliage in the hair. I'd never heard before that Mao was using Sun Tzu, and that, it makes it sort of as if they're using their own tactics and culture to fight the invading barbarians.
If you look at what Xi Jinping is doing to this day in the high Himalayas, in the South China Sea, and to some extent in the East China Sea, it's the same stuff. It's incremental approaches without pulling the trigger. So this is Sun Tzu, the winning without fighting. So Sun Tzu has been brilliant classical strategist, and his thinking is applicable not just to the Korean War, but to today's hybrid war, which the PLA is fighting quite successfully without, unlike the Russians, who are using a very old school form of war of conquest. The PLA is achieving things without actually fighting.
This might be an inappropriate question, but
Oh no, not an inappropriate question.
I'm not sure. But do military generals and people on either side of these conflicts, do they respect each other for the tactics? Sort of how football coaches or cricket, they might go, I didn't expect that one. Do they look upon each other with respect about how they conduct it, or these surprises, or?
Yeah. I mean, absolutely. I mean, and particularly in hindsight. I was hoping to make a television documentary after my first Korean War book came out. I had a very famous producer, Dan Gordon, who's made a lot of documentaries in North Korea, in which we're going to bring some Korean War veterans back to the Imjin River to talk through their big battle there in 1951. And then we were going to fly to Beijing to meet Chinese veterans. And he'd done some reconnaissance in China, and the Chinese said, oh yeah, we'd love to meet the Brits. They were some of the best soldiers in the war. It'd be really good. Sadly, that documentary didn't take place. We couldn't raise the money, so that's a lost opportunity. But I'm thinking of another. I think maybe 20 years ago. This was back when Anglo-Chinese relations weren't as bad as they are today. There was a Chinese student studying in the UK, I can't remember where, and her mother came to visit her on vacation in the UK, and her mother had been a PLA nurse during the Korean War. And so she actually met, while she was in England, a lot of the British-Korean War veterans from the local area, and they all got along very, very well and took photographs with each other and so on.
Nice.
So, yeah, I think, again, in hindsight, you can admire your enemy, but on the battlefield, you're trying to kill each other.
And we have similar stories perhaps about the North Korean football team a decade later in Middlesbrough and these kind of things at the World Cup. So perhaps ideology, because I just want to ask you about this. It was an ideological battle, but yet, again, in hindsight, we know that we'd rather be in this Korea, I'm quite sure. There was talk of deserters and people going, and it would have been interesting at that time for the people on the ground, these big ideological conflicts, but without the internet and without the news, do people even know what communism and open society were at the time? This is maybe not a question for the historian, but was it an ideological battle?
I mean, again, my general focus has been on the British Army and to some extent the Australian Army and the Belgians in the Korean War, not so much the Americans or the South Koreans. The British Army is a very, very non-political army. They're not an ideological army. I think the Americans are a little bit more ideological. You know, the Reds, the Commies, they talk about that a lot more than perhaps we do. But the Brits, again, they didn't have much idea of who they were fighting. People hadn't heard of Kim Il-sung. When Pyongyang was captured, the journalists went into the first guys to sort of move into Kim's sort of office, the equivalent of going into the Führer bunker. Said, this was where the great Kim was. But even then, back then, they called him a dictator. And these were not necessarily, particularly right-wing people, as most journalists are. They recognized that he was a dictator or was dictatorial and was allied with Stalin because, again, we talk about the personality cult of the Kims, which started in the late 50s and 60s as the Cultural Revolution was underway in China, and it kind of as a reaction against that. But actually, if you look, and you can see this in many, many photographs of as British and other troops advanced into North Korea, they'd do target practice on these public pictures, big pictures of Kim and Stalin, which were up in public squares in Pyongyang and even in villages further north. But people didn't really know it until they got here. So when in the Battle of Pakchon, when the British were falling back over the bridge and they're coming back through the checkpoint, there's the rear guard, the guys who were the last guys to pass through, were coming through one of the checkpoints. I think the sergeant major who was manning it says, get a move on, boys. The next guy to come down this road is going to be Joseph Stalin himself. But of course, none of the soldiers had heard of Kim Il-sung or Mao Zedong at the time. As you say, they didn't have a great deal of information. So they were following orders. We're fighting against communism. We're fighting for freedom. But didn't know much about it. But I'll tell you one thing that one of the veterans did say to me, which has always stuck with me. He was with one of the Scottish regiments that fought later in the war. And I met him on a veteranary visit here. And he had subsequently, his battalion after Korea had gone to Kenya to fight the Mau Mau uprising, which was a very nasty affair in which the British forces did not acquit themselves well. This was at the tail end of colonialism. There were extraordinary cruelties committed by British security forces. And he said it was very, very clear to me that in Korea we were fighting for freedom, for the freedom of the South Koreans, against a communist invasion, which it was. Whereas in Kenya, we weren't fighting for anyone's freedoms. So it was clear to him. Again, that's with hindsight.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd never heard about using the big photos as shooting practice, but that makes perfect sense.
I can show you them. It's not much use in a podcast, but I can show you physically.
Citizen deaths, I've heard that, and please correct me, that unlike other warfare, there were more citizens, or civilians, I should say, that died in here. 2 to 3 million in the Korean War, and normally it's the soldiers that bear the brunt of it because they're on the front line, but because the front moves up and down.
I mean, yes and no. If you look at the history of warfare, some wars are extremely clean. There's very, very little civilian. I mean, look at the two wars we're looking at now, Ukraine and Gaza. In Ukraine, with one exception, which was an early battle called Mariupol, when there was no evacuation of the civilian population, so the fighting was among the civilians. But in all the big battles since then, Severodonetsk, Avdiivka, Bakhmut, the civilians have been evacuated before the battle really gets underway. So the civilian casualties, except for Mariupol, where the mass graves are so large you can see them from satellite, has not been that hideous for the civilian population. Whereas in Gaza, Hamas have realized, as many soldiers have over the years, that for a defender, a city is a force multiplier. As the Soviets realized in Stalingrad, as the Poles realized in Warsaw, and as the Germans would finally realize in Berlin. It's a good place to really bog down an attacker. And of course, if the civilians are still in the city, as they are in Gaza, you get real carnage. Now, Korea sort of falls between those two extremes. It wasn't super clean, but it wasn't murderous. There was not a huge amount of city fighting or street fighting. What there was a very, very heavy campaign of air bombardment by the US Air Force. Americans use firepower rather than waste manpower. Okay, so there's two forms of aerial bombardment. There's tactical air force, which is your fighter bomber, which will come down and strafe an enemy position in the battlefield. And if your enemy position's in a village, that's bad for the villages, particularly a Korean village in the 1950s where, in summer or in the dry season rather, just one tracer bullet will ignite the thatch and then the whole village will go up. If you're using the incendiary, which was used in the Korean War, which was a combination of naphtha with palm oil, so naphtha, palm oil, napalm, it's this gel that's dropped from a canister from an aircraft, and instead of a high explosive which blows upwards so you can shelter from it in a trench, this will roll downhill like lava and just destroy and burn everything. It burns at 800 degrees, 8 times hotter than boiling water, and because it's got a gel in it, it sticks to everything it touches. So it's a hideous weapon. But it wasn't a banned weapon of war. It was used towards the end of World War II, but it was used in much larger quantities in Korea and later in Vietnam. So this was a hideous weapon against the frontline soldier. But when you use that in a combination with high explosives on towns and cities where civilians live, it's absolutely hideous, I don't know if millions died, but it's possible. No one really knows because we don't have the figures from the Soviet and Warsaw Pact field ambulance. They were all over North Korea, but I don't think they collated totals, and of course we don't have it from the North Koreans themselves. The North Koreans themselves were in such disarray, they probably didn't have great record keeping or census anyway, so the answer is we don't know. We do know from our own sources that North Korea was flattened in the sense that British soldiers who were captured in April 1951, they walked the entire length of North Korea, because the Chinese were taking them from the battlefield in the south up to the prisoner of war camps, which were just south of the Yalu River. So these guys went on this hellish odyssey through just this deathscape. So that every village we came to just no longer existed. The civilians were living in holes in the ground with thatch over them, and all that remained of the villages, and this is a spooky image, and you can see it in photographs, were just the stone chimneys. Everything else had burned down. And just village after village, town after town was destroyed. So how many were killed? Well, if we compare it, contrary to what a lot of people will tell you, and it's not difficult to check this, far more ordnance was actually dropped on Germany in World War II than was dropped on North Korea. But even so, massive amounts were dropped on, to the point that in Pyongyang, I think 2 buildings were standing at the end of the Korean War. The deaths from Allied bombing from 1940 to 1945 in Germany, estimates range about 700 to 800,000 civilian deaths. And those are in urbanized populations. Bear in mind that North Korea, there were cities and towns, but it was pretty dispersed population. So my guess would be, I wouldn't think it's more than German civilians were killed. A shorter war, less explosives, and a much more dispersed population. When I spoke, and the areas that were most heavily bombed were on the Yalu River, notably Siniju, the city of Siniju. I've been to Siniju. There's not a single old building there. It's completely modern, as you'd imagine. But I interviewed years ago a Soviet air defense guy who'd been in Siniju during the war. The Soviets very secretly deployed an air defense division into North Korea, and the bulk of it was around Siniju, because that's the gateway from Dandong, into Siniju in North Korea. And he said what would happen was that the American bombers would come over, and we'd be firing up at them with our air defense, and it's like the entire sky would be on fire, and bombs were falling everywhere. And in the morning, the smoke would clear, and said the Koreans would come out of their shelters and their holes, and would rebuild their homes, which were huts and thatch. They didn't have much. This was a peasant society. He said, you can't really bomb peasants, because peasants don't have a lot to bomb. And and the Americans again didn't learn this lesson. They tried applying it again in Vietnam. Didn't work in Vietnam. If you're using largely high explosives, you can survive it by being underground. Napalm, on the other hand, you can't escape that stuff. And again, I remember one of the soldiers telling me they were passing through this sort of market area in this ruined North Korean village. And there was an old guy in the middle that everyone was avoiding. He was just covered in Vaseline gauze, and he'd lost his mind from agony, and he'd just lost the surface of his skin. And so, soldiers were divided on napalm. Some of them said, wow, this is just what we need, to get dug-in troops out of the way. But I say it's such a horrific weapon.
Is it
We'd
banned
rather
now?
not have it. I don't think it's no longer used because we've got other more effective weapons. I mean, you've heard of thermobaric weapons, which is what the Russians are using in Ukraine. That's fuel air explosive. So that creates a cloud of fuel and then it detonates. And so the air itself explodes.
Oh, wow.
So that's pretty nasty. And so you don't need napalm anymore in that sense. So, yeah, as far as I'm aware, napalm is no longer used. Thank God.
Yes.
And the press called them hell bombs. Even the Western press realised what a hideous weapon this was. And earlier in World War I, when the flamethrower, Flammenwerfer, was invented, even by the Germans, people, that's a nasty weapon. There were some units which we don't want to use these. We've got too much respect for the opponent.
Naphtha and palm oil making napalm. Before we talk about the end of the war, prisoners of war. Yeah. Have you managed to speak to any, or do you know any stories?
Sure. One of my two books covers the annihilation of the Gloucester Battalion, Battle of the Imjin River, and many of those were captured. So spent 2+ years in the prisoner of war camps up north, which was a very unpleasant experience.
Are you able to say anything about what it means to be a prisoner of war in the 1950s? I mean, in the North Korean... Very
unusual. I think our concept of a POW is from World War II. You're in a camp surrounded by barbed wire and casernes with machine guns and searchlights and so on. The prisoner of war camps in North Korea were just villages that had been taken over for military use. There were no minefields, there was no barbed wire or anything, because where are you going to escape to? You're a Caucasian, or in a few cases, you're a black guy. You stand out like a sore thumb. You're deep in East Asia, so just your physical features give you away. To the best of my knowledge, nobody escaped from any of the prison camps. So a lot of guys made a lot of attempts, were recaptured. And the guys would say that in North Korea, perhaps surprisingly, the old people tended to be quite kind to the prisoners of war. One of the guys was saying he'd lost his bowl on the march, and he came across some North Koreans in a market, and they were just older guys, and they had these sort of melon gourds they were drinking from, or perhaps wooden gourds, like the Buddhists use. And he I think he did a deal with one of those. He gave them a coin or something, and they gave him a gourd. So for the rest of the march, he had something to drink with. But a lot of the guys said that, the old people were quite nice to us. There was no sort of real sense of hatred. But the young people were much more fanatical, because, of course, they'd grown up under Kimism. And, one very famous soldier who later wrote the official British history of the Korean War and was the first guy to go to China and speak to Chinese generals and see some of the Chinese archives. He was captured, and on one of his many escape attempts, he was in I can't remember, he was in or near a house, and the old lady there sort of just ignored him, said, stay where you are, don't worry. But her son saw him and immediately reported him to the police, and he was taken away and given a pretty severe beating, and he was also waterboarded. The Koreans did that.
So Alfred Hockley, am I getting the name?
Anthony Farrar Hockley, who subsequently became a very, very famous soldier.
There's
wrote some very good books too.
Apologies for getting the name wrong. It was there somewhere in Max Hastings' book on the Korean War.
Which is a very good book. Yeah.
He has a story about prisoners of war, where the North Koreans have British and American prisoners of war in a village, like you say, but at night they're all singing songs and laughing with each other, and they're very surprised why this is happening, because they're meant to be scared and shocked to be deep in enemy territory. And it was later revealed that they were sitting in a big temacho, or in a big hemp field, and the prisoners of war were sat there just smoking up and singing songs and laughing.
I mean, so some of the resistance in the camps, to me, sounds a bit ridiculous. They had these songs. One was, and remember, these are young men. We are mature. We're old farts, right? But most soldiers are. If you're 25 as a soldier, you're an old man. They had songs like the Chinese would teach them sort of revolutionary songs, and they would add their own words. And one was, "Who flung dung at Kim Il-sung? Mao Zedong, he flung dung at Kim Il-sung." And the guy who sang this song to me said, we realised it was a bit stupid. It was a way to keep our morale up, and of course, it infuriated the Chinese.
It reminds me of the Pueblo pictures, is it? Where the soldiers are...
Oh, the Hawaiian good luck charm when they're giving the finger to the camera, yeah.
Yeah.
But the hemp, you're right. Yeah, the hemp, of course, at that time anyway, grew wild in North Korea, so a lot of the prisoners would smoke that. It was just a way to... I mean, in the prison camps, they weren't necessarily forced to do labour. They were required to attend re-education sessions. Which basically meant a very earnest young Chinese communist was going to tell you the evils of imperialism and the glories of communism. And people said that, they weren't necessarily unpleasant people, but it was incredibly crass and boring. And so just the battle against boredom became part of it. Of course, those guys like Derek Kinne, who subsequently became extremely famous, the man who Churchill considered the bravest man he knew of, he was in the prison camps, and every chance he got, he would rebel, and he got very, very seriously filled in. He was a Chuck Norris, but in reality he killed a camp guard and escaped multiple times and so on. And so he said to me, if I'd been in the hands of the Japanese in World War II, they'd have cut my head off immediately. I don't know why the Chinese didn't, but they didn't kill me. But he was pretty badly beaten up on multiple occasions.
Was it Derek Kinne that sent a mail of human feces to someone?
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
Can you tell us a Derek Kinne story before? Or is that... I mean, this is a man that Churchill called his Bulldog?
That's right. Yeah. He died a couple of years ago, rather sadly. Derek was an interesting character. He had been in the British Army before the Korean War. And he was a bit troublesome. And he said he spent most of my time in military prison because I was always causing trouble and fighting. He was a big, tough guy, And he left the army, and when he was walking out of the gates, one of the sergeants shouted to him, "Kinne, don't come back. You'll never make a soldier." So he had no plans of ever going back. And then his brother was killed in North Korea, fighting with the Argyll and Southern Highlanders. And Derek and him were very, very close. So he said, I decided I was going to go to Korea to recover his body, which was lost, and kill as many communists as I could. And he said, I never found my brother's body, but, the second promise I made, I pulled off. So he went to the front line, he volunteered, and he said, I'd hated soldiering in the UK where it was garrison duty, but the front line I was fascinated by it. If there's a day patrol, I'd go on it, and if there's a night patrol, I'd volunteer for that one too. And so on the Imjin River, when the big Chinese attack came through, he was a machine gunner. He said, I can say this now. He said, don't put this in your book. I don't want my wife to think I'm a butcher. But the most fun I've had in my life was just mowing down Chinese with a Bren gun as they assaulted towards me. And it's just... But anyway, he fought. He was overrun. Fought again on the last day of battle in a counterattack. Then, as the brigade's position imploded and thousands of Chinese poured down literally on top of them at the end of the battle, he was captured. And he said, "I remember thinking, well, my war really starts now." And so, in the prisoner of war camps, anything he could do to resist the Chinese, he'd do. So he'd steal a lot of food, steal rations. When Western leftists came to lecture the prisoners of war, guys like Wilfred Burchett, Alan Whittington, who were sort of quite famous communist journalists, British and American respectively, and they were embedded with the KPA and the Chinese. Whittington was actually the first guy to report on Nogan Ri, I think, because he was with the North Koreans who took that ground in the very early days of the war. So these guys came to sort of lecture these prisoners of war, and when it was Burchett who gave them this lecture on how they were, near imperialists, and then said, do any of you men have any questions? And Kinne stands up and goes, yeah, I've got a question. Actually, I've got a statement. It says, you're a bloody traitor, and after this war, you'll be bloody hung. So the Chinese dragged him away and slapped him around a bit and threw him in the river, But yeah, he, more seriously, at one point, in one of his, I think after an escape attempt, he was put on serious punishment, which means he was beaten up and put in almost like a coffin, a standing coffin. They called them wooden boxes for solitary confinement. You were standing up, you couldn't move. And he said, I'd had enough, I thought. And there was a nail in the back of the box, and he started smashing his head against the nail to kill himself. And the Chinese guards saw this and opened the door of this box, this sort of wooden cage. And Kinne just came out, and the two started fighting. And the guard's submachine gun went off and killed the guard. He said the other Chinese soldiers were standing around looking down in shock. He said one of them was smoking a cigarette. So I just reached up to his mouth and took the cigarette and started smoking it, thinking it's the last cigarette I'll ever have. But actually, the Chinese didn't kill him. He says they really beat the hell out of me after that one. And he was, his George Cross citation, this very high medal for gallantry. It's the longest one in the history of the award. It's just factor after factor after factor, things that he did. After war, he emigrated to the States, and was living a normal life. And at that time, it was the Vietnam War. And again, there were a lot of protests against American involvement in the Vietnam War, some of them led by these left-wing journalists, one of whom was Wilfred Burchett, who was speaking at a campus, I think it was Kent State, I can't remember. And this was during the Nixon election campaign. And some of Nixon's people heard about this rather tough, bold British soldier who had met Burchett in the camp. Said, "Would you like to meet Burchett again?" So, "I'd love to meet that guy." So when he was scheduled to speak before some students, and in the middle of his presentation, Kinne said, "I remember you from the camps, you bastard," and came shot. And he's quite a big bloke, Derek, and apparently Burchett was astonished and did a runner. Yeah, but Burchett later lost his passport. The Australian government refused to renew his passport. And so he was stateless, and so he was preparing a legal case against Canberra, and he put out an international, what would today a GoFundMe campaign, but of course not via the interweb. So asking for donations to fund this legal fight he had, and Kinne heard about it, took a box, defecated it in the box, and sent this box of shit to Burchett, which was quite funny. I don't know if Burchett received it and opened it, so courtesy of Derek Kinne, but that's one of the funny stories. Yeah. Quite a real character, Derek Kinne. It was a pleasure to talk to him.
Yeah, amazing and well remembered and well honoured. Do the Chinese have an equivalent of a George Cross? Is there a Chinese Derek Kinne? That's a ridiculous question, but they must have a similar.
Oh, I mean, I'm sure they have. Yeah. If you, to this day, you can still see when the remains of Chinese soldiers are still being found here and there in South Korea, and they're flown from South Korea into China, and when they unload the coffins, with the Chinese flag in it and stuff, and a guard of honour, there's normally a few very, very old, fragile veterans of the CPVA who, just like our veterans, are standing there in suits and with their medals on their chest.
Yeah. On both sides. The end of the war, Andy, is it because Stalin dies and Eisenhower's
basically,
elected?
Yeah.
Is that
as we now know? And again, this only came out because we knew about the after Gorbachev came into power and then Yeltsin took power in the USSR. Well, after the fall of the USSR, and Yeltsin was the head of the Russian Federation. The archives. A lot of the old Soviet archives were open. A number of historians were able to go in and look at these archives, including over the Korean War. What we didn't know then, but we do know now, is that the negotiations, which started in summer 1951, and the war only ended in summer 1953, so they dragged on for 2 years. Yeah. At the time, it was believed that these communists are just such tough negotiators, and there's books being written about this, negotiating with the communists. What we now know is that Stalin had basically ordered Mao and Kim, who both wanted to end the war, so this is going nowhere, keep fighting in Korea, keep the Americans pinned down while we rearm. So I think only after Stalin dies, suddenly the negotiations are concluded and bingo, we have an armistice. So Stalin, I think, was absolutely the key. Otherwise, the war could feasibly have finished 2 years earlier, with how many hundreds of thousands of lives saved.
What was the result? Was it a score draw? Was it? I mean, it's why I'm asking this question. Normally, even Wikipedia will say the results of the war. Obviously, technically still ongoing. How do we conclude the Korean War?
Well, as you say, technically it's ongoing. Yeah. But look out of your window. I mean, this is a land that's at peace. Yeah. So, as long as the status quo remains, we're in a very, very survivable situation. We here in South Korea, right? I mean, I think if you look at the war's aftermath. Out of the two Koreas, one Korea made pretty much all the right moves. It moved through, economic upgrades, an economic miracle, it's fair to say. Then we had a political miracle, democratization. I think right now there's miracle is probably too strong a word, but a social, cultural miracle in which South Koreans have become as liberal and liberally minded as North Americans or Western Europeans, and as prosperous as North Americans or Western Europeans. I think if you could magically lift South Korea up and drop it in North America or in Western Europe, South Korea would do absolutely fine. Obviously, Koreans are a different race, they've got a different language and so on, but in terms of their daily lives, their beliefs, their aspirations, their values, how they lead their lives, we're all the same. We're liberal Democrats, right? That's not true for North Korea. North Korea made almost all the wrong moves. We went from having a country which was rebuilt after the Korean War with the help of the Soviet Union, the broader Warsaw Pact, and was part of that overall trade. But I mean, I was speaking to a Russian academic last night. He said, when I grew up in the Soviet Union, we used to think North Korea was the most backward of all countries. We used to laugh at them almost, because very obviously, as we now know, they've gone from being a sort of communist state to a paranoid, ultra-nationalistic, ultra-militarized dynasty. It's a neo-monarchy now. There's no other nation in the world that's taken that disastrous trajectory. So nobody won the war. South Korea won the peace. And if you've ever been to North Korea, if you've met North Koreans, it's very obvious to me where I'd rather be living. The basic rights and freedoms that we've got to meet one another, to travel, to get free information from newspapers, magazine, books, from the internet, to have international telecommunications. All these really such extraordinary basic rights and freedoms, which we don't even think about them, are alien to North Koreans. And there's the great tragedy.
Self-imposed, a lot of it as well, which makes it even more tragic.
And I don't necessarily see, I think perhaps you have the same experience, you speak to a lot of young people, I don't sense that there's any great desire remaining here for reunification. I suspect that reunification, there's enough middle-aged and old people to make it maybe for one more election. And I think the left wing, the DPK, Democratic Party of Korea, they want engagement, they want eventual unification. But I think the young people now, they don't really consider North Korea to be the same country as them. I think rightly, for reasons just spoken of. They share the same language, but their life experiences are radically different, which is one reason why North Koreans have such an extraordinarily difficult time in South Korea, to the point where a number are actually emigrating to the UK. They find it an easier place to live. And if you look at the global geopolitical situation, we're not on the whole seeing countries getting bigger. One obvious contrarian example being Russia, which is invading places and absorbing them. This is old school wars of conquest. But if you look at Yugoslavia, the USSR, Czechoslovakia, they've all broken up into their component parts. Britain has done Brexit. And I think in our lifetimes, we may see the United Kingdom break up. And if this is the democratic will of the people, so be it. So we're getting smaller polities, not larger ones. And I think that sort of argues against any inevitability of reunification, which is sad and tragic, because if unification did somehow take place, everything's good. The global family of humanity can welcome 25 million fellow humans. The Chaebol get an entire new country to develop almost from the ground up. Companies from across Korea and the world can open whole new markets, and a whole new nation of people join together, and the demographic crisis in South Korea is at least temporarily reversed. And of course the strategic casus belli in the center of Northeast Asia sort of disappears. The question is, how do we go from where we are now to reach those sunlit uplands? And I think there's no answer to that. I think by war, regime implosion, I don't think there's much else on the table, at least not now.
You said that this place is very safe. Look out the window. I believe I shared with you the story of my brother-in-law, the lieutenant colonel in the Korean army. Yeah. And it's safe because there are a lot of young men and old men that are standing up there at the border with their guns pointed, and they're doing very dangerous things, a lot of them. I believe it was Tonin Bum, a retired general, who said in your piece that if people knew what was going on, they might be a little bit more scared than they actually are. How do you evaluate the military capabilities of the situation today with South Korea and North Korea? You can extend that into America and China as well if you want, but what's the current military?
Let's talk about Korea. I mean, these are big questions. I think there's a belief here, and it's a misplaced belief, that we have the technological advantage, and so North Korea is unable to fight us. I would disagree with that. We have we being South Korea, sorry, certainly has the technological advantage in air assets for sure. The North Koreans don't really have an air force worth talking about. Their navy is not that great either. It's a coastal force, but as we know from 2010, it's an extremely dangerous force. In terms of ground forces, the North Korean armed forces are almost twice the size of, I think slightly more than twice the size of the South Korean armed forces now. And whereas the South Koreans, the conscription period here is 18 months, I think, and getting shorter constantly. Up there it's 10 years.
For men and women, I believe.
Yeah. So you've got a far more militarized society. And if you speak to, off the record, people like your brother-in-law, they're tearing their hair out. The young kids today, they don't want to do military service. The officers can't do much about them because since the last administration here, they're now allowed to have smartphones. So every time there's a tough exercise or something, the kids can call their mothers. The mothers will say, "What the hell? The kimchi wasn't very good today, or you've been out in the rain." They'll call a hotline, and the colonel or the major who's in charge of the unit will get yelled at by his superiors. So this really is deleterious for a lot of training. So it's problematic. I think the South Korean army 10 years ago was very, very good. The South Korean army today, I speak to military units a lot. I spoke to 3 different units last year, and they all said pretty much the same thing. They said the Koreans are great to work with, very friendly, very easy to get along with, nice guys, but they were surprised at how unfit they were because they thought that in the mountains here the Koreans would be real racing snakes. He says they weren't as fit as we were. They weren't as attuned to cold weather training as we were, which surprised me because the Korean winters are severe. We had to sort of teach them. But said most of all the problem was their leadership. Their officers are fine, but they don't have an NCO corps, which is the backbone of most Western armies. So the Russian army has the same problem. So you don't have this mid-level management, which is what holds your force together. And he said that's hugely problematic. And it means I was watching it's the same for the Japanese, apparently, even though the Japanese have a professional army. You're in a hierarchical sort of semi-neo-Confucian society. So a lot of your exercises and drills, you're not really testing your capabilities. You're making sure nobody loses face. So I was watching an American Special Forces guy talking about all the Special Forces he'd worked with around the world. And he says the worst I've trained with are probably the Koreans and the Japanese. And that's not because they're not tough or fit or well-trained or well-equipped. It's because this issue of their leadership. That the exercise is sort of set up so nobody has to lose face. So there's a lot of problems in the armed forces right here, right now. Korea is very, very fortunate, I think, in the strategic context of having the most powerful country in the world as their allies with a mutual defense treaty. So America brings a lot to the table, including deterrence. And deterrence is working. It's worked since 1953. There are cracks in the armistice. People have been killed. Ships have been sunk. Guerrillas have infiltrated. There's been an artillery bombardment on Waipido, and so on and so forth. But generally speaking, the status quo has held. And there's a belief that deterrence works because if Kim did ever go for broke, it's the end of his regime. What's now a little bit concerning is that the possibility of a Trump 2 administration in the UK, and some of the people who are sort of in the Trumpian camp are very, very much concerned about China, to the point where they're saying, we cannot break our spear fighting North Korea. We've got to reserve our main force, our massive maneuver, to fight China if that ever comes. So, well, what does that mean for the Mutual Defense Treaty? And I think this is one of the reasons why in this very radical, very liberal policy that Yoon Suk-yeol has instituted, which was a surprise to everybody, he's massively upgrading ties with Japan because he realizes that combined, Japan and South Korea, formidable force militarily, formidable combined voice diplomatically. We need to be in bed with these guys, but of course there's a lot of very, very old-fashioned conservative thinking, which is but the Japanese colonized us. We can't ally with these people. And I think Yoon, to his credit, has seen the incoming potential risk of American support for Korea and Japan eroding over time under a Trump or under whoever's next. And we've got to have, we've got to firm up alliances elsewhere. We can't just rely on the Americans.
I believe it was Michael Breen that said President Yoon Suk-yeol's move in aligning with Japan more closely was a little bit too progressive for the Korean people. They weren't quite ready for it. The animosities still go.
I mean, clearly, and again, I think there's probably one more election where, political forces can leverage that emotion. I think the young people, the ones I speak to anyway, increasingly don't really care. I think partly because there's no longer a chip on the shoulder. In many metrics, Korea's overtaken Japan now. And so, why do we have this long-held animosity when we're doing better than they are? They're no longer the big brother, sort of. So, yeah, I think, I'll tell you, I mean, the reason I've sort of come to this thought is just a couple of weeks ago, I had 2 separate conversations with 2 separate friends, both Westerners, both married to Koreans, both in their sort of late 40s, both with children in their children at school age and at university age. And they both had identical experiences completely separately, which was that the children had said, Mum, we want to go to vacation on Japan. And both dads said, yeah, why not? And both mums had said, no, we're not going to Japan. We don't like Japan, But as I said, that I'm getting a sense. This is anecdotal. I don't have data to back it up. I do get a sense that the young generation of Koreans don't retain that long old animosity.
My nephew, during when he was at high school, and this is in the mountains of Gangwon-do, during the President Moon administration, my nephew was given homework to go around to all the shops in the village and write down any Japanese products. And they then wrote these on the wall and implored nobody, you should not buy these. And so that's how, remember when you were talking about the Chinese and the North Koreans and the South Koreans as well, how the elderly were a little bit more open sometimes, and it was the young radicals that were going at these. There is a little element
in 1950, again, Korea had been in a state of flux for half a century prior. And so there was no particular animosity towards Westerners among the older generation, but among the young generation of North Koreans in 1950 and 51 who had grown up under this, fairly extreme communist regime, it was a different thing. So even back in 1950, there were generational gaps and different life experiences separating grandparents from grandchildren.
Last question, I'll put you on the spot with this one geopolitically before we close up. A lot of people I've spoken to have said Trump is winning. We can't look into the future to November. I do remember that you were very fearful at one point. You thought about leaving the peninsula last time he was in office. I might be putting words into your mouth, but
I think you're thinking of someone else.
Brown trousers or something, I think, might have been your words. When there was talk of rockets and fires and things like this.
I mean,
frankly, I don't want to put words into your mouth. I'm sorry.
If it happened again, I would not leave the peninsula,
right?
Because this would be the biggest story of my life as a journalist. I mean, how could you leave? Regardless of my sort of, Korea's been very good to me, and I've got some emotional attachment. This is my home, right? Yes. But I would want to get my family out, then I would want to be reporting this extraordinary cataclysm.
Thank you for correcting that. I apologise if I misframed it or misrepresented you. Are we right to be a little bit apprehensive or fearful about what might happen? The rise of China. I know that people talk about that, or is this?
I'm not so apprehensive about the rise of China. It's my sense that, and we discussed this a little bit earlier, that Xi Jinping is playing an extremely clever game. His idea of warfare is non-kinetic; it's hybrid. So what he's doing is he's building bases in the South China Sea. His guys are inching forward in the line of actual control in the Himalayas. I mean, there's a very interesting video that came up just a couple of days ago. It shows a fist fight between Indian and Chinese troops and a rock fight up in the Himalayas. And all these Chinese are coming up. They grab at an Indian, there's a punch-up, and then the Indians start hurling a barrage of stones at these guys. And all these Chinese troops, they're in armour and helmets, but they've all got their weapons with them. And to their credit, not a single man thinks to hell with this and just starts spraying away. So that's good discipline, that's good fire control. Same thing in the South China Sea and the East China Sea. Yeah, the Chinese are using water cannons, they're using ramming tactics, they're using push and shove with fishing boats, but they're not actually pulling a trigger. The PLA has not fired a bullet in action since 1988, which is when they had a small but intense naval battle with the Vietnamese in the South China Sea. So I'm less worried about the PLA than I am about the Russians, who, this has gone back to the old pre-imperialist, Tsarist, Cossack playbook of just storm in. And that's right on the door, the front door of Europe. So that the fear of escalation there, I'm far more worried about that spinning out of control than Xi Jinping seizing Taiwan. And what's something that's very I've reported it, but not many people have. What is greatly underreported in this region is that the doors for two of the critical entry-exit points for an invasion of Taiwan, which is the Miyako Strait, which is south of Okinawa, north of Taiwan, and the Bashi Strait, which is south of Taiwan, north of the Philippines, are now pretty much closed to the PLA Navy if war were to break out, because the Japanese, are now, since the invasion of Ukraine, have been moving a lot of their ground defense force from Hokkaido in the north of Japan, which was Russia facing, to the southern Ryukyus, which is where there are disputed territories, the Sengaku Islands, and where the Chinese Navy, that's one of their entry points to the Blue Water Pacific. So they're now fortifying the Miyako Strait and other areas with missile bases. Meanwhile, because the Chinese are being so aggressive in the South China Sea, the current Philippine administration has invited increasing numbers of US troops to rotate through, including in northern Luzon, and they've got mid-range Typhoon missile systems there which dominate that strait. So over the last 2 years, that means that if push came to shove, the PLA couldn't encircle Taiwan because it would be a suicide mission. They couldn't get back home. Which leaves them with one option, and that's straight across the Taiwan Strait into the teeth of Taiwanese defenses. So that's the strategic concept. Where does that leave Korea? If this did ever kick off, what would be the role of US forces in Korea? If you look at the deployment of US troops in Korea, it's changed radically. They're no longer on the DMZ facing North Korea. They've pivoted down to the Yellow Sea coast. They're now China facing.
So the main basis wasn't to allow Korea to take the most forward position, but it was a strategic pivot to...
Well, this is the question you should ask the architects of this policy. It's difficult to get a straight answer.
Yes.
And that it's not just that. Jeju now has a naval base, a South Korean naval base on it. Jeju is inside the first island chain. If you want to exit, if your carrier strike groups in the Yellow Sea and your naval shipyards in Shanghai and Dalian, they've got to bypass Jeju. That's an unsinkable aircraft carrier at the mouth of the Yellow Sea. So the Chinese now have got to, if they were ever to go to war, they've got to think, what do we do about all that string of American bases? Ulsan, Pyeongtaek, K9, and Jeju. Do we preempt? Or could we be attacked, from there? So these are all great unanswered questions. And no one in Korea, and I don't blame the Koreans, want to talk about this, because China remains a pretty significant economic partner, right? Yeah. So it's difficult to get a simple answer. I've asked a former head of USFK, we had dinner, and he said, we are postured to defend against North Korea, not against China. I said, well, as I said, that string of bases, air, land, and sea, hubbed around Pyongyang port, that's on the Yellow Sea, that's not on the DMZ. So Korea is now perhaps more strategically sensitive, given the rise of China, than at any time since the end of the war. That having been said, for reasons I gave earlier, I'm less worried about China than I'm about Russia.
There are a quick question on this before I ask you something about Putin. There are currently roughly, correct me if I'm wrong, 28,000 American troops here. You
can never tell because people are always coming and going, but that's roughly the number.
Roughly that. Is it correct that during times of peace, South Korea has control, and if it goes to war, the Americans take charge? Is there 2 4-star generals? What I'm asking.
You're talking about the Combined Forces Command. Okay, so what the Koreans and the Americans have, but the Japanese and the Americans don't have, is a CFC, Combined Forces Command. Okay. So that means if there's war, they can fight together. They can interoperate. And that's really important. I mean, in World War II, the British and the Americans were fighting on the same side. We speak the same language. And we had problems with unified command, right? A lot of battles between generals and stuff. But it's critical in war not to divide your forces. You've got to share the same objectives. And that's why the CFC is such an important instrument, Combined Forces Command. Problematically, for the South Koreans, we know who's going to be in charge, right? There's no country in the world, let's be honest, has an equal relationship with the United States. It's ludicrous to believe so. The United States is economically and militarily the most powerful country in the world. That's a fact, whether we like it or not. So anyone who has a partnership with the US, including the UK, we're junior partners, right? And that rankles with the South Koreans, and understandably so. And yet the CFC is an extremely capable force, because to have interoperability, which you hear, there's a term you hear a lot, That means your forces have to use the same ammunition, the same batteries, the same fuel. They've got to, and this is where it gets very complicated, you've got to link your electronic suites between aircraft to ground, aircraft to aircraft, aircraft to ship, missile battery to ship, and so on, within a single command structure. And that's incredibly complex to do. But the South Koreans, the Americans, can do that because they've got this combined command. And the Japanese now are talking about doing the same thing with the larger American force in Japan. And I think that might happen. I think there are steps being taken right now, but it's a huge project. Yeah. And of course, in Europe, we've got NATO, which is all about interoperability and combined command and, combining your assets. But it's a very difficult thing to do. If that is ever dissolved, I think that would be militarily problematic for the alliance, but might be politically to the advantage of the government in Seoul.
To make this situation even more complex, currently on his way, maybe there now, President Putin, Vladimir Putin, is going to Pyongyang. He's going to meet Chairman Kim Jong-un. We've spoken about Stalin's influence and everything there from Kim Il-sung. You said that you're worried about Russia. What's going on with Putin in your estimation? Is he playing the wrong cards? Is he getting a bit old in the tooth? Is he doing it successfully?
Well, I mean, if you look at Putin's record as a warrior president, which Xi is not.
Since '88, I like that fact. Not a bullet fired in.
Yeah, right. Yeah. But Putin, came to power around the time of the Chechen Wars, and the second. Russia was humiliated in the first Chechen War, but it won the second Chechen War under Putin. Then it fought in various places around. It fought in Dagestan and won. It fought in Georgia and won. It intervened in Syria quite effectively. It took Crimea, and frankly, a brilliant operation. And Russia also fought, under camouflage in Donbass, less successfully since 2014. So if you look at Putin's career, he's been successful on the whole until Ukraine. I think Ukraine may be a bridge too far for him. Now, let's hope so. But Putin now is in a bit of trouble. He clearly didn't expect this war to last long. We know now because he attacked in the time when in Russophone warfare you never attack in spring because you can't maneuver off-road. And that's why all the Russians in the early days of the war, remember, were ambushed in column of road because they couldn't deploy or maneuver their vehicles. Right? It's the Rasputitsa, the time without roads. Even in World War II, from 1941 to 1945, the Russians only ever launched one spring offensive because it's so difficult to do in that climate. So we know that he wasn't expecting a real war. He was expecting it to be a drive-in and an overthrow. Now he's bogged down in 2 years of war. And of course what's happened is he has been removed from international polite society. The West, his persona non grata, his economy is persona non grata, and to an extent the global North, the wider West, i.e. the South Koreans, the Japanese, the Australians, again, they're keeping him at arm's length. So he's got problems. He's sanctioned to hell. North Korea can assist. It can assist him with weaponry because they use Warsaw Pact equipment. So their artillery, 152mm. A North Korean shell will shoot from a Russian gun. Same with their tactical rockets, 122mm. But this is dumb ammunition, which is very, very important in this war. Weight of fire is critical. We know that. But Putin may want more. I think Kim is able to get oil. His economy doesn't use gas, but he can get oil from Russia, which it's got. It can get grain, which it needs to feed the people. And may get some technical assistance with some military technology. What's Putin might want, as well as this supply of munitions from the military-industrial complex in North Korea, which is about 26 to 27% of their GDP. So, yeah, that's massive. That's huge. Yes, it can supply weapons. To me, the interesting thing is, does Putin want to put Russians into North Korea? And I'm talking about Rajan Sumbong, because Vladivostok freezes over in winter. That's problematic for the Pacific Fleet. So if he got some kind of naval base, even if it's just a place where you can anchor 2 or 3 frigates or corvettes or minesweepers, you've dispersed your fleet to some extent, and you've got a warm water naval base that is operational all year round. So some of the Russian sources I'm talking to think that could be on the table. And that, of course, makes, North Korea has nuclear weapons, so no one wants to risk war. But if they've got nuclear weapons and Russian troops somewhere on ground in North Korea, a war becomes completely unthinkable. And that also gives Russia much more presence in the Sea of Japan, or the East Sea, if you prefer. So there's a lot that could be on the table here. And as someone said to me, the bigger picture is that, both Russia and to some extent China, 10 years ago, they probably looked down on North Korea and thought a Chinese and a Russian will say, we're never going to be like North Korea. What's happening now, particularly in Russia, is they're becoming more and more like North Korea. Let that sink in. They're becoming much more paranoid. They're becoming much more militarized. Their freedoms of their citizens are being more and more restricted. Their opposition is all falling out of windows, allegedly. It's becoming a one-man state. So I don't think Putin is going to install family rule like Kim, but it's starting to look like a one-man state up there. So again, for Russians who grew up in the USSR, you laughed at North Korea. You thought these guys are backward. But Russia is now starting to look more like North Korea. And of course, North Korea does have resilience. It's been able to defy the Western world and remain outside the bulk of the global economy for the last decade plus.
Lasted longer than the Soviet Union.
And it's outlasted the Soviet Union.
Yeah, I thought you were going to relax my mind with that answer, and you've done the opposite by talking about warm water ports, Russian warm water ports in North Korea.
This is speculation.
Yes,
we don't know if this is going to happen, but that's something that could be on the agenda.
What have you learned about the world, about humans, about life through your study of war, Andy? This is kind of a very broad but kind of closing question.
Yeah.
I think you understand the question. It's is war inevitable? Is war always with us? Or
let's talk about. I'm trying to think who wrote it. I think it was Gwyn Dyer, the historian. He said the first time in the history of humanity in which 1,000 human beings gathered together in one place, their intention in doing so was probably to kill each other, because warfare requires organization and mass. Hunting requires organization. War, you win by having more and more people. And hunting and war, there's some similarities. For example, when we were hunter-gatherer societies back in 200,000 years of prehistory, the average human unit was 20 to 50 people. The smallest military unit is the platoon. That's 30 people. So that tells us that kind of unit is manageable under one leader, a charismatic leader or tribal leader, whoever it may be. And we know throughout most of human prehistory, the dominant form of warfare, probably the only form of warfare, was slave raiding. In a pre-industrial society where you don't really have possessions, you might have some weapons, a few mammoth pelts or whatever. What is the only asset, the only resource that you can take from another group of humans? It's other humans, women and children, right, who become your slaves or absorbed into your tribe. And this form of warfare has persisted into the 21st century in some parts of the world, right? And as humanity progressed, one could argue, warfare changed. As we got agricultural civilization, we got bigger groups of people who are able to organize to fight each other, and technology develops. And so, but warfare is still about capturing resources, right? It's about capturing land, territory, classic war of conquest, and the people who live in that territory, because those people can work for you, or they can be your slaves, your serfs, or whatever it may be, depending on your political situation. Then later in sort of the history of humanity, we get wars of religion. Notably, the Crusades, the Western Christendom, aggresses into the Middle East, or the Ottomans aggress into Europe, and so on. But again, they're still about resources. You're capturing holy places and the people inside them. And later we get wars of ideology. But again, you're still capturing resources. Economic resources, geopolitical resources, people. Who you convert to your ideology and so on. So from prehistory to today, war's actually not that different. It's just fought with much larger numbers of people, much more destructive weapons. But it's still all about capturing resources, right? So is it inevitable? Well, let's go back to the earliest form of warfare, which is slave raiding. Slavery persisted across human history, from the earliest form of slave raiding and absorption, and then agricultural civilization. You have slaves working in temples and for embryonic governments, and then you have slave societies. You have slaves working as gladiators for your sportive entertainment, or to row your ships, your warships, as galley slaves. Later, of course, we have that horrible form of slavery, transatlantic plantation slavery. And yet, so slavery is as much a part of the human condition as warfare. And yet, what happens in the 19th century? We have this abolition movement, which changed the world radically. Formerly, you had slavery everywhere in every society. As far as I'm aware, slavery in one form or another was universal, be it in Europe, be it in what becomes Latin America, be it in sub-Saharan Africa, be it concubine slavery in the Middle East, you name it, serf slavery, chattel slavery, China, concubine slavery, Korea, and so on. And yet, after a 40-year campaign, a military campaign and diplomatic campaigns by first the British, then the other Europeans, then the Ottomans, and it spreads across the world, slavery is abolished within 100, 150 years. There are slaves in the world today, but they're not openly. The concept of slave transactions, slave commerce, slave markets, doesn't exist anymore. Show me a slave market now. Where would you find one? So we got rid of one of the greatest scourges of humanity within the space of a century and a half. Slavery is gone. Could we do the same with warfare? Well, if you look at human history in the last 50 years, we're living through a golden age of peace. If you read Steven Pinker's excellent book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, he traces how warfare has declined and human rights, everyone's rights, animal rights, liberal rights have increased over centuries. Mankind is actually getting better. Humanity is good, or getting gooder, right? And yet we still have wars. So could we outlaw war? Well, it's become much, much more difficult to wage war now because there are so many political and economic pressures not to fight a war, as Vladimir Putin is finding. And yet here's the problem. How do we stop slavery? By military force. The West African Squadron physically stopping slave ships crossing the Atlantic Ocean. That was the beginning of abolition. How do we stop war? The only sanction you can apply to a nation not to go to war is to threaten them with war. So there's an irony which is at the center of this. What other economic or political or diplomatic pressures can you bring? Well, the Western world is trying this against Russia now. Diplomatic isolation, economic isolation, and yet the war goes on. So I think we're stuck with war because how do you stop it? You can only stop war with greater military force.
You had me in the first part. I thought you were going to say, just like we got rid of slavery, that we'll get rid of this one too. But it's...
but the answer to slavery is not greater slavery.
Yeah.
The answer to war is greater military force to deter the other person from fighting a war.
No. Andy, you've made me think about things in such a way today that is incredible because it steps back from social media. It steps back from the warp and woof of the daily report, and I'm so incredibly grateful for it, honestly.
Thanks for the invitation.
A book.
Let me finish by saying, God, what's today's date? It's the
17th.
It's the 17th. There's a bit of a bet underway among
17th
some
of June.
Yeah, among the foreign correspondents. When is Putin going to show up in North Korea to meet Kim? No one knows, because obviously Putin's movements are kept very secret. He has to worry about assassination. So we won't know until he appears with great pomp and circumstance in Pyongyang. Two bad actors meeting, right? So we were all thinking it's probably going to be in the next few days. Could be Monday, could be tonight, could be Tuesday. But a Russian source said to me, I think it's going to be June 25th.
Oof.
Why would that be? Because that would be the anniversary of the Korean War. And then these two leaders can look back on their great-grandfather's generation, say this is when we stood shoulder to shoulder against the UN command, this sort of like Western-led force. And that would have immense symbolism in North Korea and Russia, because Russia's now fighting a war kind of against the West and against the global North. And Kim, in a sense, never really stopped fighting, or certainly never stopped resisting.
Yeah, we'll wait and see. Andy, a book, a movie, a drama, give us a recommendation of one of these. It doesn't have to be everyone, but a book you recommend people read, a movie, and music. It can be related to Korea, it can be related to war, it can be Mark Knopfler, it doesn't matter. Give us a book, a song, and a movie.
I would say a movie which most people have never heard of, but tells you a great deal about the Korean War. If you're not interested in the Korean War, don't watch it. It's incredibly dull. But if you're interested in the Korean War, it's a fascinating movie. And it's a movie called 그 섬에 가고 싶다. which is translated very unusually into English as To the Starry Island. It's a movie starring Ahn Seung-gi, who's a very famous Korean actor. It's basically about a guy who returns to an offshore island for the funeral of, I think, his father. And the story is told in a series of flashbacks of what happened on this island in the Korean War. And what's often overlooked, you've touched on it a couple of times, is the ideological nature of this war and how that played out in rural communities where people didn't understand the difference between democracy and communism. So what happened, and this is a very, very unpleasant aspect of the Korean War, is all the petty jealousies of village life were exacerbated by the conflict. And people could, hey, here's a communist, or hey, here's with Rhee's guys. And this could play out, and it's very underreported. But this happened. And in the movie, what happens is because it's an offshore island, no one's really sure who's winning the war. And then a boat full of North Korean soldiers comes to the island and says, hey, we're here to liberate you. We're with Kim. We're from the north. And some members of the village go, hurrah, we love communism. That's tremendous. You're just the guys we need. And then the guy, okay, thanks. Nice to meet you. And then they peel off their uniforms and they're South Korean troops. It's a trick. They say, right, you lot come with us, and they're going to kill them. And the village schoolmaster runs up to these soldiers and says, don't you guys understand? They've got no idea what communism or capitalism or democracy or totalitarianism. These are just peasants who are taking advantage of the war to get ahead. And that's sort of the theme of the film. And it's not very widely watched. It's in many ways not a great film, but it does cover that very, very nasty aspect of a civil war within an ideological war within a peasant community.
I'll get it watched. Music?
I'm not a K-pop listener, I can't. And of course, I didn't listen to the music of the 50s, to be brutally honest with you.
Andy Salmon music? An album? A band?
I mean, there's one, it's a brilliant song, a rock song, brilliant video. In fact, one of the best videos ever made. But it's quite an old song from 1982. It was written during the Falklands War. But if you look at the video, some of it looks like it could be Korea. And the lyrics also sound like it could be about the Korean War. But the guy who wrote it, Mark Knopfler from Dire Straits, never actually identified which war it was about. The song is called Brothers in Arms. And it's sort of, now it seems a classic of guitar rock. And it's the narrator. It's never clear if the narrator is a dead man talking to his live comrades, or a live man who's the only survivor of a unit that's been wiped out and he's the last man left alive. It's a very moving piece of music, but it's also a brilliant, brilliant video. And it's become iconic in since the war on terror. So across the Anglosphere, in the UK, the US and Australia, this is the song that a lot of veterans want played at their funerals. But again, I would say listen to the song. It's about a war, any war, but a lot of the lyrics about mist-covered mountains and valleys and farms, very redolent of Korea, and some of the imagery in the video also looks a little bit like the Korean War.
I know the song very well, but I've never consciously listened to the lyrics nor watched the video, so that's...
it's on YouTube. Yep. It's not hard to find. Brothers in Arms, Dire Straits.
Love it. Mr. Salmon, thank you very much.
Hey, cheers, mate.
And relax. We're done.
We're done.
Yeah.
Good.
Brilliant. Brilliant.
Okie doke.